Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to this week's video on the Devonian period of the Paleozoic era that we've been learning about in the timeline of life. So if you notice, the Devonian period is on our timeline is a little bit longer than the Silurian period and that we learned about last week. And so in the Silurian period last week, we learned that life made it into fresh water and made it onto the land. And we saw some of the first mountains. Then the earth cooled down again. And at the beginning of the Devonian period, it warmed back up. You might be noticing a trend here about what happens at the transition between different periods of the Paleozoic era. So let's see what happens today. The Devonian period is the fourth period of the Paleozoic era. 1, 2, 3, 4. The Paleozoic era. It lasted 60 million years, which was a pretty long time, from about 419 million years ago to 359 million years ago. It is named after Devonshire, England, where rocks from this period were first studied. So that's where we get the name Devonian, Devonshire, Devonian. The Devonian period is called the Age of Fishes because the sea levels were high. Again, they had risen because the ice had melted, and there was a great variety of fish and other marine organisms in the oceans. Again, the earth was covered in about 80% of water. And we can see here some of the examples of things that were in water. We still have sea stars, we have corals, we have some other fossils of marine life. Devonian fish included jawless fish and spiny fish, armored fish, the placoderms. And we're going to learn quite a bit about the placoderms in our video from YouTube today. The cartilaginous fish, which are fish that had skeletons made mainly of cartilage, which is if you wiggle your nose, if you put your fingers on your nose and move it back and forth, you'll notice your nose will move. That's because it has cartilage in it. It's softer than bone, but still holds its shape, but it's flexible. During the Devonian, the evolution of fish into tetrapods. Tetrapods are animals with legs that can go onto the ground, onto the land, occurred. So some of the very first fish, their fins evolved into legs, and they were able to crawl onto the land. And also, various insects became established on the earth, on the land. The first seed-bearing plants spread across dry land as well, and our first forests grew. So before the Devonian period, back in the Silurian and the Ordovician and the Cambrian, the plants, well, in the Cambrian and the Ordovician, the plants were all in the water. In the Silurian, the plants made it onto the ground, onto the land, but they were not the kind of plants that had seeds. So the first plants that were able to produce seeds show up on Earth during the Devonian period. Also, in the Silurian and the Ordovician, there was most of the land was in the southern hemisphere around the South Pole, the supercontinent of Gondwana. Now, in the Devonian, Gondwana is still in the south, but it's starting to move, okay? And the continent of Siberia is in the north. So there's some land in the north now, in the northern hemisphere, in the upper part of the earth. And then there's a small continent called Euramerica that's kind of in the middle. Over the time of the Devonian period, 60 million years. Remember, that's a very long time. Gondwana from the south and Euramerica, the smaller continent in the middle, they start to come together, get closer and closer. They start to combine, and they will eventually be the supercontinent Pangaea, which will come later. You may have heard the name Pangaea before. Now, near the end of the Devonian period, there was another mass extinction, just like there was at the end of the Ordovician, and the smaller extinctions at the end of the Cambrian and the Silurian. The extinction at the end of the Devonian period was much slower, but it was a mass extinction. Nearly 80% of the life on Earth went extinct at this time, but it took a long time to happen. It took about 20 million years, which is about a third of our time, which on our map here looks very short, but 20 million years is a very long time. Scientists think what happened is that as the plants on the land grew and expanded, and there became more of them and they got bigger, they used more carbon dioxide and spit out more oxygen, which changed the atmosphere of the Earth. It made the Earth cooler, so the Earth starts to cool down. It also changed the amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the water, and caused areas of the water, especially the shallow parts of the water, where many, many new creatures had evolved during the Silurian period. That part of the water became very low in oxygen. And so animals need oxygen to survive. They needed it back in the Devonian period, just like we need it now. And when there wasn't enough oxygen in the water, many of the species went extinct. They died. So these are the pretty important features of the Devonian period. So we're going to add our pictures to our map of the timeline today. And it looks like the first thing we have is a fossil of a sea star. And I think I see it right here. All right, here is my sea star, and it goes really very close to our ice age. It was in the beginning of the Devonian period. We see this. So we still see sea stars. Sea stars, we saw sea stars in the Ordovician, we saw sea stars in the Silurian, and now we are seeing them in the Devonian. This is one animal that we still see today. There are still sea stars, so they have survived for a very, very long time. What else do we have? I see one of these guys. These animals, the sea scorpions, remember, they evolved during the Silurian period, but we still see them in the Devonian period. And like I mentioned before, we also see the armored fish, the placoderms, which I don't think I see any on our timeline. The placoderms were the biggest and most ferocious hunters of the Devonian period. No. Oh, there it is. It took me a minute to find it. There is our sea scorpion. All right. So There's our sea scorpion. And that goes, it goes right in there. I might have to, if my glue's not dry, I might have to move over my sea star just a little bit because it's a little crowded up here on this top line. These words here say, ferns began to develop woody tissues and roots. So that is part of the Carboniferous period we'll be learning about next week. During the Devonian here, we still have corals. And we have Radiolaria. I am probably mispronouncing that. And we have sea lilies take the form of trees. So that was an evolution of our sea lilies here. Okay, so let's get our creatures back on our timeline here. Let's squeeze this guy in. And here, there we go. Let's squeeze this guy in. Enough to fit right next to each other. There we go. And if we look down here between our Ice Age at the end of the Silurian and the line at the end of the Devonian, I am not seeing much more here other than words. Let's see the marsh plants here. They are kind of, we glued them on last week, but they are kind of right in between the Silurian and the Devonian period. And there's fish with cartilaginous skeletons, like we talked about before. Their skeletons were made of cartilage, like what is in your nose. And then we have some primitive sea lilies start to disappear. But down here at the very bottom, it looks like we have one more animal to add, and that is an ammonoid. These ammonoids, they evolved from our nautiloids. Nautiloids were long and cone-shaped, and if you notice the ammonoids, their shells, instead of being long and cone-shaped, start to curl. And so that might be an interesting animal too. And I found it. It is on one of my smaller pieces here, down at the bottom. That might be an interesting animal to research. And I wonder why that evolution started to happen. Why the shells started to go in a spiral shape instead of a straight cone shape. There we go. All right, here is our last animal for this week. We only had 3. 1, 2, and 3. This one goes down in the bottom in this space. All right. We are out of view. There we go. So, there we go. All right. And that concludes our prehistoric timeline, our timeline of life for this week. Have fun putting together your timeline and doing your research, and we will see you next Friday.